this year, um, in March this year, I had a Zoom interview with Mari, who is in her 50s. In 2014, her then 20-year-old daughter Nina was radicalized within a group mainly consisting of converts to Islam. It all happened in less than 6 months. Nina's phone call from Syrian border came as a total shock to Mari, and Mari said that she fell in paralysis. Because of Mari's job profile, she's office worker at Defense Forces. Mari called the security police and explained the situation. She was asked if she needed support, but Mari declined. She said there was no way to understand what the next weeks would bring. The entire bureaucratic mess with my daughter's flat, the social security service, her institute. Mari then reviewed Nina's next 2 years, two marriages to ISIS fighters, their sudden deaths in battle, births of her two sons, and how she ended up in Al-Hol camp in Syria, where she still is today, nearly 6 years after she left. Mari said, Nina managed to contact me through WhatsApp at Al-Hol, and I promised to send her money through Western Union, but very soon afterwards the bank began to suspect me of money laundering and my account was frozen. Then they informed that I'm no longer a customer, which meant that I had no longer functioning ATM card or credit card. It was such a hassle. No other bank was willing to accept me as a customer. This is the point where I finally totally collapsed. I took 2 weeks of sick leave. As Mari's and Nina's case shows, the radicalization of a loved one is a massive burden for the family and community, and it may take several years, as in this case. It involves both psychological, economic, bureaucratic, security, and policy-related consequences. If we think about Nina's case, her reintegration back to the society one day when she returns cannot occur without the support of a wider public. Whether we're talking about family or larger community. How will she ever integrate without being accepted back to the community? Present-day violent extremism is very complicated. It's complicated in terms of its ideological basis, and it's also functionally very diverse. It's more and more network-centered. It affects all sections of the population, regardless of ethnicity and religion. 10 or 15 years ago, it would be inconceivable to encounter cases like Nina's. It's more hidden than ever. It's spreading via constantly evolving cyberspaces. Unfortunately, it will shock many more parents like Mari in the future too. The main question of my report was that what kind of societal challenges has extremism created across Europe, and how have they been addressed by directing support measures at the family and community level? What can be said about the best practices to support families? What kind of challenges related to the topic are there? The countries under focus in this report are Great Britain, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, Norway, and Finland. And the task was massive, as we know, there are practically thousands of people working in the field of PVE. There's massive amount of projects, so no way I was able to grasp the entirety of this question. But these countries under focus, they differ both in their extremist environments and in their strategies to respond to the challenges posed by extremism. Of all these countries, United Kingdom and Germany have the largest environments of both Islamist and far-right extremism. And as we know, they are often in symbiotic relationships with each other. Belgium and Netherlands witnessed a substantial mobility to conflict zones in Syria and Iraq. And the recruitment of socially marginalized young people was a very, very big question in these countries. Finland and Norway have still rather small extremist environments. They are expanding. They are more and more interlinked with movements elsewhere. And in both countries, the security institutions have noted increasing activity of far-right extremism. Many of the things that have been implemented in other countries should be implemented here now before the extremist environment evolves more. The sources that I used for this report were interviews with authorities and representatives of organizations in the target countries, 19 of all of them. I was hoping to do much more, but because of the COVID, it's extremely difficult to grasp, to catch all of you specialists for Teams meetings. So I had to reduce the number of interviews. I also interviewed 3 parents who experienced the radicalization of their child, as in the case of Mari. And I also read quite a substantial amount of research reports, webinars, documentaries, organizations, web pages. And I must highlight that there's a wonderful webcast series called Talking Terror, which is provided by SoundCloud. And those of you are interested in updating what is going on in terrorism and extremism related studies, that's a site to look, because there's more than 70 top quality interviews with the best scholars of the subject. So Talking Terror is the site to go to. The main results, just briefly, some main points of based on what I found out based on these interviews. Well, there's a very widespread perception among the practitioners of PVE and family support programs in target countries that the entire environment of the radicalized or vulnerable person as a whole must be taken into account. So there's a considerable move away from this kind of individual-centered approaches to much more broad-based approaches. The family and the surrounding community must be part of the programs. And many of the practitioners who do this work, they actually share widely the idea that when the overall security, long-term security of the society is a priority, the interventions often they may look for the public that it's actually something like being too understanding towards extremism and terrorism, and the programs have to balance between these opposing ideas. There's shared awareness that preventing extremism can today produce actually in the public quite extremist reactions. And I'm quite sure that many of you have gone to social media landscapes and followed the questions, for example, regarding returnees from Syria and Iraq. And the debate over there it's very extreme in its nature. So it's quite painful to see that preventing extremism actually creates very extreme reactions in the public. In some countries, the support and counseling services are very well developed, especially in Netherlands and Germany are at the forefront with these developments. And in some countries, these programs are just taking shape. In Finland in particular, it's pretty much just Finns Church Aid and a couple of other institutions that have made so far initiatives with this regard. In the UK, the government Prevent Duty program produced a large public debate about its objectives and large criticism, and it's quite interesting that these similar type of reactions have not reached the same scale in other countries. Everyone that I interviewed who works within this field emphasized that most important resources in this work is time and trust. Trust building takes a lot of time, but because of the project circle and because of the lack of available financial resources, it's often very, very difficult to have possibilities for proper trust building. It's also widely recognized that organizations rather than state authorities are flexible to reach the community level. And also what was emphasized is that the support measures should be focusing on simultaneously on social, mental, and economic challenges. Also very widely shared idea was that because of the rapidly changing nature of extremist environment, there needs to be a constant development of the services. So we never sort of finalize the product. A few recommendations. In each country, there has been a very rapid evolvement of peer support networks, and I would very much like to see that these peer support networks would be more involved in the development of projects and policy programs. One thing that has been pointed out by scholars, and I will definitely emphasize this fact, that we need much more thorough evaluations of interventions. They must become a standard practice in all interventions. Inexperienced work can have very negative and often very unfortunate consequences. So I think that in each context, we must encourage scholars, experts to develop the evaluation criteria that are suitable for particular contexts. And because of the fact that I think that we are witnessing a time where extremism is changing very rapidly, there needs to be much more done with regard to raising general awareness of extremism of our time. I would like to end my thoughts with returning back to Nina and Mari. At the time of our discussion, Nina had spent 2.5 years in Al-Hol camp. She was not willing to give up her ideas. Mari keeps trying to convince her to change her mind. She says, "Just a few days ago, I tried different strategy in WhatsApp. I told her that here at home, you have more room to spread your religion. It's a sign of strong faith to come back. You have 2 sons who do not have any nationality or documents. Just think about them." She then continued that over the years, countless times, she was in need of what she calls standard answers. What to do when your daughter tries to convert you, she says. How to respond when she refuses to come back. What to say when your neighbor says, "How's your daughter?" How to send your child money so that you don't get in trouble. I would like to end here and give the floor to Daniel Köhler, who is the director of German Institute of Radicalization Studies. Please, Daniel.
Thank you, Marco, and thanks for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here and speak to you this evening, in my time this evening. You asked me to talk a little bit about the current challenges from developments in extremism regarding family support and peace CVE. So let me just share my screen. I've prepared a couple of slides for you that I hope to take you through. You should see the slides. Marco, if you could just let me know if you can see the slides. Okay, great. I want to start a little bit with the background, the theoretical basics. As you said, Marco, in some countries like Germany or the UK or Netherlands, family support programs in the context of PCVE have a long tradition, actually. While in Germany, I was involved in building the first family counseling programs in the context of Islamic extremism or jihadism in 2011, 2012. In Germany, at least, there was a much longer tradition of working with families of neo-Nazis and right-wing extremists. So there was a very well-established practical experience of how and what to do with the emotional environment, with the relatives of extremists. Generally, we know, and this is an encouraging fact, that families and friends, the close social environment of people who radicalize, in most cases, at least notice some kind of change. And this has stayed true over the years in various different forms of extremism, of crime, of deviant behavior. Even those individuals that have been called lone actors or lone wolves, who are considered to be especially isolated and radicalizing alone, even in those cases, the majority of them, their family and friends, learn about their extremist radicalization or their attack plans. They get at least a sense of something's changing. If they cannot tell the signs, they at least feel something's happening, something bad is happening. And these numbers are usually way beyond or way above 60, 70, 80% even. And this has This has stayed true even with the most recent developments of more online-based radicalization, etc., new forms of dynamic radicalization, conspiracy-based radicalization, etc. So even though that the pathways of radicalization have changed drastically, become quicker, more interspersed, more transnational, more even contra or ideologically mixed, sometimes online-based, for example, still, in most cases, we see a change of behavior that translates into the offline world. And this is something that I find personally very encouraging. When we started in Germany to introduce these family counseling programs, 2011, 2012, we knew that in the field of jihadist extremism and what we knew at the time about radicalization, in most cases, the families and friends will notice some change. And this was our idea that if they notice a change, they could call a specialized family support program that helps them to interpret, to make sense of the signs. We weren't sure if this kind of concept would hold water over the coming years and decades, if radicalization process would change to a point where families and friends to minority have no idea what's happening. And I just recently worked on a research project that looks at the online gaming structures and far-right radicalization of minor children. And it turns out that even in those cases, were highly online, highly isolated, had almost no contact really left with their family. Even then, it was their offline change in behavior in school or in the family context that caused suspicion, and then in the end resulted in the intervention of state and non-state actors. So roughly, we can still say that in most areas of radicalization, extremism, the family and friends still notice some change. The change itself might look different compared to 10 years ago. The signs of the radicalization process might have changed. And this is where we need to adapt as programs. We still know that family networks are essential, even in radicalization processes, positive and negative. So there are still many, many family networks and relative networks that contribute to radicalization instead of helping us to counter it. This is also something that we need to be aware of. We also know that PCV programs, early prevention, but reintegration, de-radicalization programs, the whole spectrum, they need to work on various different levels to be effective and successful, including the so-called ideological, the pragmatic level, like drug therapy, aggression therapy, trauma therapy, anything like that, and the effective level, which is the emotional, social environment of a person. So however we look at the problem, family and the social environment, friends, colleagues, fellow students, they need to be involved to have a long-term, successful, sustainable PV or CVE process and effect. Now, this comes because there's something called leakage in criminology. When people change, either they become ordinary criminals, or they become involved in gangs, or they become involved in extremist circles, in their mindset or physically, they begin sending signs to the outer world. Most of them, the vast majority of them do. They change their attitudes, they change their language, they change their clothing, they change the way they behave around certain people. And these signs are usually noticed, as I said, by the communities, by the families, long before something illegal, something criminal happens, when law enforcement, intelligence agencies have to become involved. This is still true that families and friends in the communities are the first line of defense when it comes to detecting radicalization as early as possible and intervening appropriately. This is because radicalization in its essence is a public phenomenon. People who radicalize, like a virus, they want to spread the message. They want to recruit to their ultimate truth. It doesn't make sense from a perspective of a radical environment to keep everything secret and confidential. At least there are stages in the radicalization process where they will spread the message to someone in their close social environment. The question is if that someone is actually noticing it and recognizing it and knowing what to do with that kind of information. Marco, as you said, some countries have barely any infrastructure, and if they don't know where to turn to, obviously they don't know what to do with that kind of information. Also, we need to understand that family-based programs have different goals and targets and methods regarding different phases in the radicalization process. In the first phase, the entry phase, where they get close and develop a radicalized mindset, for example, this is where the family is most important and where we can do most with the family, together with the family. If they recognize it as early as possible, obviously, there's the whole range of social work tools, psychological tools, all the different methods that we have at our disposal to help these kids turn away from that pathway leading to criminal and potentially violent behavior. So here we can do really the strength of family counseling programs is to help the family become a positive counterforce to really counteract the push and pull factors in the radicalization process. And they can do this because they are closest to these children in most cases, if there's still a working relationship, a stable relationship between the parents and the children. Once there's an active involvement in extremism, there are criminal acts, there's violence, maybe there's prison, they distance from the family if the family is not radical extremists themselves. And this is part of the radicalization process. They simply distance from those who are against this kind of development. And this here, the goal of the family counseling program changes drastically. It's not about forcing them out. It's not about really massively counteracting the radical messages, because at that stage, it would be too late. It would just be used as an argument to cut off the contact to the families and parents. So here, the goal is to strengthen the emotional bond, to stabilize the communication, to remain available, to show that they're open, trustworthy, in case their kids come to a point where they're in doubt, where they are confused, where they're frustrated, where they are maybe in shock, where they are lonely, and they need someone to turn to. So it's really to provide that one psychological bridge that they need in their heads to be available if that point comes where they think about leaving. And then in the disengagement or the exit part, the family is again one of the most important partners. As you said, Marco, it's the family and the social environment who really helps them to reintegrate, who provides them stability in terms of trauma, PTSD, if they have pending judicial actions and prison time ahead of them. It's the family that provides stability and support to them. There's almost no way of a sustainable reintegration with a positive social environment, be it family or friends or others. Maybe a family is not around anymore, but the family is obviously the first choice if possible. Now, what are the main methods that have established itself over the last decade when many Western countries have introduced these family counseling programs? It's usually, as you said, Marco, there's a lot of search for understanding. Families want to know, why is this happening? Did they make any mistakes? Is it only happening to them? Why and what is going on? Why are their children attracted to these environments? Why are they certainly thinking they to hurt someone? Why are they becoming criminal and violent? They don't understand the situation, and they want to understand situations. It's a lot of seeking out knowledge and understanding so that they feel competent in these very, very difficult situations. So it's to provide them conflict solution strategies, de-escalation strategies, knowledge, really explaining to them what and why is happening. And we usually do this to help them analyze the communication, really explain to them what is your kid telling you right now, and where are these words coming from and what are they talking about, really to help them understand. Usually family counseling programs are also a key network broker. They provide context to external service providers, for example, psychological, mental health experts, social workers, educational professionals, but also the authorities and the police. In some cases, and I have had many as a family counselor, parents would call me and tell me, listen, I want my son to be in prison in Germany rather than dead in Syria. I want that he does not go on killing anyone. And if that means locking him up here, I'm on board with it. So explaining to them when and how the authorities have to step in and how the family can be involved proactively and positively to steer the process. It's reestablishing trust between the families and the communities and law enforcement intelligence, because there's usually no direct contact and talking going on between these two sides. So providing context to authorities, to other experts, mediating between the family and the security authorities, providing basic information, risk analysis, and strategic network coordination. These are the main tools that still are highly valid and highly important, regardless of the changes of radicalization processes that we currently face. And this is the end that I want to talk about. What are the current main challenges? And you, Marco, you have mentioned some of them: quicker radicalization, different channels and pathways of radicalization, different milieus. The far-right extremist milieu has a major uptick over years now in Western Europe. So first of all, we need to think about it to go beyond jihadist or Islamic extremist environments. It's very many different extremist environments currently that affect youngsters and children and the teenagers. The far right, for example, extreme right, strategically for a decade now has groomed teenagers and young children to become highly radicalized on online gaming platforms or via other channels. They become younger and younger in all these environments. I have worked in cases where kids 10, 11, 12 years of age have plotted terrorist attacks. They were so radicalized that they were involved in terrorist attack plots. They are so young that the police cannot prosecute, investigate them because they're not legally responsible for anything of their actions. So this leaves the community and the family as the only ones who can do something until they turn of age where the police can get involved. So they get younger, but still the same thing. Once they radicalize, if there is a stable family relationship or if there's a social environment, they usually learn about these changes. The changes look different, so they don't really know what kind of changes are going on, but they feel that changes are going on. These online milieus are obviously something that the families' environments don't know about. They don't know about TikTok, they don't know about Snapchat, they don't know about all these different platforms that these kids are using where extremists are also present. So it's about basic knowledge that families are, again, put into the position where they can safeguard their own children, where they can make informed decisions about parenting and about their own upbringing and socialization of the children. And this is lacking in many, many cases, basic knowledge about where and how modern radicalization takes place. These conspiracy mindsets are spread: anti-Semitic, racist, anti-corona, COVID-19 conspiracy mindsets are also spreading massively among children via different online channels. And this also leads to an open door mentally to further extremist radicalization. And this is something, how to counter conspiracy mindsets is something that has barely been researched and puts these families into a very, very difficult position. Then again, here is something that you, Marco, have mentioned: evaluation and quality of the programs. We are, unfortunately, even after a decade of many countries introducing dedicated family counseling programs to PCVE, we have not really progressed in terms of evidence-based, what works and what does not. Most of these programs have never been scientifically evaluated. Most of the staff in these programs working has never been formally trained as family counselors or in extremism, CVE, PVE. We have made very little progress. So while there are many more programs around now, the quality of those programs varies significantly. And you can imagine that working with individuals who are a pathway to violent extremism, if you have an ill-trained, ill-designed program who basically do not know what they're doing, it's not only a waste of resources, it's actually dangerous. It can make matters worse. So training, quality standards is the absolute most important point that I can tell right now, because if your program is not well designed, if you don't have quality standards, if you don't have training, you are even worse equipped to handle current challenges of modern radicalization. So quality and staff training is the absolute essence here. This is where you should invest massively in. And then we have conflict of interest with the judicial process. You mentioned returnees from Syria and Iraq. This is something that I've also learned. When you work with families, to a certain point, they obviously are cooperating to get their children back from Al-Hol or from Syria. Once they are back, they usually face charges and they face prison time. And then suddenly, some of these families, they shift their priorities. They want to get their children out of jail or not go into jail in the first place. So it can happen that these families completely shift around and say, oh no, they never went with ISIS, they never were with ISIS, and this is all a made-up story, etc. So you need to be aware that your role as a counselor can change drastically if different perspectives and goals within the judicial process come head to head with each other. And this is also something that we have learned in various other countries and experienced over the years, that this is a current challenge new that we are facing. Now, these are some of the main challenges and some of the points that I wanted to make. Obviously, there's a lot more research regarding the role of families, regarding the standards of staff training, for example, in PCVE. I've written a study outlining the different components and modules of a high-quality CVE personnel training, for example. We have quality standard handbooks in English available. So the material is there. The knowledge is basically there. It needs to be applied. It needs to be really used by those programs on the ground, so that they are best equipped to handle these changes, these challenges that are coming up. And you, Marco, you said it as well. I couldn't really phrase it in a better way. We don't need to have that standstill. We need to adapt. We need to develop continuously with regarding new challenges, new developments. And this is only working when we have a highly developed, well-trained, well-designed program that actually knows this, that there are changes and knows how to adapt. And this is something that I've been arguing in some of my work for many years now. And unfortunately, in many programs, this has not really arrived yet. And I think that's the key challenge for future work in this environment. So I hope this was interesting. I hope this made a couple of points that you were hoping to hear, Marco. And I'm obviously happy to answer any questions. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I'm sure that this will generate a lively discussion. I would next ask our panelists, Alice Karmadi, Magda Roos, Nick Daines, and Teuta Advimetai to participate in discussion. Please feel free to comment, raise issues that you think that need to be addressed, or just generate a lively discussion around what you have heard. And I think that we can perhaps start the first round with this order. First Alias, then Magda. Do we have Nick Daines? Is Nick there?
I can't see Nick. He messaged me earlier.
Yeah, he told that he would be present.
I think he's in UK time. I think he's on the wrong time.
Okay. So if Nick doesn't turn up, then let's take Alias, Magda, and then Teuta. And then after that, let's see what happens. We can totally improvise. Okay.
Thank you, Marco. And again, Daniel, Marco, thank you both for your valuable contributions here in terms of obviously dealing with a fluid and dynamic changing reality. And I think what we're all agreed about is that radicalization is an ongoing process, and we are going to have non-stop cohorts of vulnerable individuals, in particular children and young people, who are going to be constantly being radicalized by the revolutionary paradigm of the time. Now, just to build on what Daniel's saying about gamification of extremist narratives and the targeting of children and young people, I've been spending the last year intensively doing my work on the manosphere and incel violence, and I've got to say, it's another area where, if you just look at the scale of the ecosystem that people are tapping into, and we're not talking hundreds or thousands, we're talking about millions and millions of people globally attaching to some of the most toxic material, which has a direct link to violence. So I think this is an important consideration, that I still feel in the PVE world, we are still so caught up with the jihadist, Islamist, Muslim, violent extremist paradigm still, that we're not recognizing the massive diversification and fracturing and almost the intersectionality, that people flip from being someone on an incel profoundly fascist, misogynistic websites, straight to jihadi beheading videos, then straight to gaming and immersing that, and then straight to porn, and then, you know, it's just an absolute, really kind of quite fluid and dynamic mix. So I think the context and how the context is changing is important. Everything that you've said, you know, really, we can't, you know, dismiss it. And when it comes to systemic family work, absolutely, as someone who's been involved in mental health work for 30 years as a therapist and a holistic therapist and a systemic family counselor as well, it's critical that we work with families. And you're absolutely right, this is a socialization process. And you know, one of the interesting things is that when we talk about prevention, how proactive do we have to be? I'm actually running a program for 0 to 4 development now. It's called Resilient Dads. And what we're identifying is that the emotional, social, and cognitive development in 0 to 4 is actually allows us to predict behavior at 15, 16 into the longitudinal studies. And what we see is a profound, what we call attachment disorders that then manifest themselves in people then connecting with other people with similar experiences and normative communities and seeking fundamentally, okay, belonging and attachment. But I think, again, something I find, Daniel, in a lot of our systemic family work is it's still very Eurocentric. It's still not culturally competent. We don't know how to work with families from enormously diverse backgrounds. We don't know, for example, we have a massive now kind of, you could say, number of Afghan refugees who are coming into Western Europe. Not a single one of those families that I've worked with have not had a family member killed and have not experienced PTSD in one form, shape or form. So, you know, Daniel, when we're talking about systemic family work, we're not talking about a few sessions here and there within a particular model. We're talking about massive intervention that the resources of our Western European countries, I'm afraid, are just not able to deal with. And then to do it in a culturally competent manner, using the appropriate, what we call behavioral activation models that really tap into people's internalized realities and paradigms and worldviews. You know, we're just not doing it. I don't want to take up too much time, but so I think early intervention in terms of early childhood in the first 4 years of development is critical. And what we're seeing is cross-generational transference of trauma as well through 3 generations, and the importance of breaking cycles of behavior. The last point I want to make is this, you know, every single one of us on a global level when it comes to PV, I think, are saying the right things. I've seen in my work in the last 15 years in this field, are saying the right things. We have the same models and frameworks and, you know, assessment tools and diagnostic models. A lot of it is there. But there is an inherent conflict when we as practitioners are undermined, essentially when this issue becomes securitized. And that's the challenge we have here in the UK. There is a fundamental conflict between psychologists, social workers, teachers, youth workers, community workers, faith leaders who do this work every day, by the way, guys, and are doing it under the radar. And, you know, I can say that I know 101 youth workers out there every day who work with young people who are at the what we call the interface of challenging and reactionary ideas, and they are channeling them away, and they don't do it under anything. So the point in the matter is that when we only conceptualize this whole approach through a security lens that is driven by the criminal justice system, and you said, and is essentially politicized, there is an inherent conflict. Because we as practitioners then are put in a very unethical position. That are we an instrument of the state, and how the state chooses to understand what are the priorities and security. So it took us a long time in the UK to wake up to our extreme far right. And, you know, the fact that what we've seen is a sleepwalking into white supremacist kind of ideas going into the mainstream. So that's an inherent conflict that we are all tackling with. And, you know, until we come to a point where practitioners who are competent in this area of work and have what I call the core competencies, as I said, examining the issue from a psychological mental health perspective, from a social pedagogical perspective, from an ideological theological perspective. We've got those tools, but we've got to be given the freedom and the autonomy to use our tools. And the last point here is this: I think all of us are also grappling with this other challenge that we have. When we have children who are more connected to the online space and their appropriate, you could say, networks and normative groups and support groups online, there is profound disconnect in our societies, guys. There is the family units have broken down. The peer group has become the source of connection, and the online space is the form. Until we create societies in which there is meaningful connection between ourselves as human beings, and that's at the heart of this, creating communities, real communities that provide support and meaningful human empathetic connection rather than the dysfunctional. You see, some of you might know that obviously in the late 80s and early 90s, I was involved in reactionary movements. And whenever people ask me, why was I there? I said, I didn't believe the ideology. What I bought into was the brotherhood, the love, the human connection, the family. And Daniel, what it provided for me was my substitute family. And the Amir was my dad that I never had because I was so detached. So there are really simple solutions as well. And the simple solution is community, real sense of community. It sounds simple, but it's actually very, very challenging because our societies have become so fractured and so broken, and we've become so individualistic. And really the cry, you know, the story of, you know, of going to Syria, that people rather live in an enormously traumatizing environment in a refugee camp because what they have there is connection. And until we provide a more powerful connection in our societies, we will always lose that particular battle. Yeah. So I think, you know, I think we're all saying the same thing, I believe. But the challenge we have is to really make it real within the kind of challenging social political context that we have. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Marco and Daniel, and thanks for giving me an opportunity to kind of make a contribution there.
Thank you, Alice. Hugely important points. Magda, 5 minutes or so, is it okay?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Marco, for the invitation. Of course, I read the report, and I think it really contains valuable information about the situation on preventive work, and then especially focusing on Islamist extremism and right-wing extremism, which are both, of course, relevant phenomenon until today, and we still have to further invest in the development of skills, knowledge, strategies, and operational structures. The report talks about the role of the families as the key agent of prevention. And what I would like to underline, what is stated in the report, that they are the closest to the individual that radicalizes, yes. But in most cases, it's very difficult for them to identify early signs of radicalization. The families we interviewed, of course, like Daniel already mentioned, they see changes in behavior in many ways, but to, let's say, really understand what is happening is most of the times difficult and lacking until, well, in many cases, they got a phone call from the Turkish border and saying goodbye and we're entering Syria. In the past 10 years that I was working on prevention of radicalization, mainly within the context of European projects, we developed several tools, among others, a tool for professionals, lesson material for schools, but also a family information portal, which is a digital platform where families can find information on what is radicalization, where can we find help, etc. And this is especially, I think, helpful because families are very reluctant to be open about what is happening, and they can inform themselves in this way in the privacy of their homes and hopefully being able to take next steps. The Family Information Portal, and I realize there are many more tools, but it's a project result, and I think it needs to be adopted to be maintained, to be further developed, and to be staying available for families. So that's, I think, something we have to discuss, to connect all these results we have in the different European countries and how we can sustain this. It has been mentioned, and I would like to call it the new phase of violent extremism, because it's still showing it in different ways to us. And I was especially impressed by the contribution of Professor Peter Neumann during the high-level conference of the Radicalization Awareness Network. And he talked about the fragmentation of ideology. So there's a new development. It's not so much, let's say, the big violent extremist ideologies, but people, young people, searching the internet, and they pick here and there certain ideas. And it makes it even harder, I think, to recognize what is happening there. Also the loosening of structures he was mentioning, and also the diversification of violent attacks. So using even more simple methods to plan an attack, using cars, using knives, etc. And I think, and this was also stressed by him, under the conditions of the pandemic, where people, and especially young people, are more isolated and spend more time on the internet, radicalization becomes even less visible and is even less easy to recognize and prevent. What I want to stress is that I think this calls for an investment in media literacy, if you want to call it like this, to educate professionals, families, and also young people on understanding what kind of information you can find on the internet, how to critically evaluate it and judge what is really worthwhile or not. We developed some lesson material for schools and also material for families, and it would be, I think, a wonderful opportunity to make the next step and include lessons on media literacy. Last point, Marco, if I may, I would like to recommend to create a platform for families. A few years ago, we had the network called FATE, Families Against Terrorism and Extremism. It was an international network where families were given the opportunity to give the testimony and also to exchange experiences, also in front of, let's say, high-profile policymakers, etc. This stopped because there was a lack of resources. Maybe we can pick it up again. There is a working group called Families, Communities and Social Care of the Radicalization Awareness Network. Mila, who's also involved in your project, is also part of this working group. And maybe it's a good idea that together with this working group on families, we also give families themselves the opportunity to talk about prevention. And so that's the fourth point. And by this, I conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Magda. We will then move to Teuta, please, and then we open the discussion.
Thank you very much, Marco, and it's a pleasure to join you all today. Congrats again on the very comprehensive and informative report. Although it talks about a very different context, so it's mostly on Western Europe, and my experience coming from Kosovo and focusing mostly on research around violent extremism in Western Balkans, specifically from Kosovo, I can tell that there are clear differences, but also some important parallels between these different contexts. Focusing mostly on the role of families. So personally, I've had the chance to interview many family members of foreign fighters, of individuals who left from Kosovo to Syria and Iraq. So speaking on the context of Kosovo, this is where most of our focus is on, so the foreign fighter phenomenon. And again, related to what the other speakers have highlighted, it's important to understand that while the nature of the threat, violent extremism, is changing, we still are too focused on the Islamist threat. Why, for example, in our region, ethno-national extremism is increasingly seen as a threat on the rise. And this disproportionate focus on Islamist extremism links with prevention efforts directly, because it means that we don't really understand what is happening on the other forms of extremism, how they are being manifested. And in that case, where are those families that we need to involve and engage with? So until now, most of the work that has been done has been with the foreign fighters, the families of foreign fighters, and especially the returnees from the foreign conflict zones. As you may know, Kosovo has been one of the first countries, not only in the world, in Western Balkans, but also in the world, to repatriate a high number of individuals from the foreign conflict zones. So in that regard, engagement with families has been mostly on within the framework of reintegration, rehabilitation efforts. And in our case, the role of families has been really important, especially because institutional capacities have been lacking. So institutions are constantly faced with a lack of funds, but as well as capacities, as it was previously mentioned, also in the context of Western European countries. So even if we have, for example, psychologists that are available to offer services to returnees in a certain communities, those psychologists don't have experience in treating PTSD related to violent extremism or being exposed to the context that they were exposed to in Syria and Iraq. So these are very important challenges that we are facing, but the role of families has been crucial because, for example, if there is a lack of services that the institutions couldn't provide, such as housing or the support network that the returnees have needed. So in cases when families have been supporting those returnees, it alleviated the burden of the institution, but it also improved the chances for those returnees to reintegrate and rehabilitate again in the society. However, it's important to also understand that not always the role of families is positive. We do have, even in Kosovo, there was a strong social network effect in the radicalization process. So in some family contexts, we do understand that the role of families has been negative. So one of the key elements to have in mind when engaging with families is to be cautious. So what has been the role of those families in the first place, and how well we can engage with them to support reintegration, rehabilitation. I think this is an ongoing challenge that we face. one of the lessons that we are learning, because again, while we don't have the experience that, let's say, in Germany, they've had to, previous experiences to refer to, in Kosovo, the lessons are still emerging. And what we do understand until now, it's important to establish trust between the institutions and those families that we are engaging with, which then, on the other hand, again speaks to the other dilemma, which is that dilemma of the conflict of interest. Because, for example, even in my experience as a researcher, while I was part of these different studies, when we speak to them, we are very supportive and open in the way they communicate. Then there's that part of them, well, but how can you help us, get our family member out of the prison? So again, it's that, challenge in making it clear that, positioning your role as a researcher and ensuring that there's, you set clear expectations in these engagement, whether as a researcher or as an institutional worker, because they have such complex situation. It's often that their expectation may be higher, and again, that conflict of interest can be a challenge. So going forward, I think one of the challenges that we face is, how do we ensure that the approach that we have towards the returnees in our case is tailored, because we do understand that women, men, and children returnees have different challenges to reintegrate and rehabilitate. How do we ensure that we apply the lessons that we are learning when we do not have or we lack comprehensive and standardized ways of monitoring and evaluating the interventions that are currently taking place? So back to your point, Marco, it's a real challenge that, or it's important that we have these standardized ways to evaluate whatever project that we are implementing, because there's a lot being done, especially with the returnees here. But what are we learning from that experience? Are we taking in those lessons, and are those lessons informing future policy? And so, in the interest of time, and probably we can address some of these aspects in the Q&A session. But all in all, there's also a need for PVE and CVE projects to be more inclusive in general. We did have the experience of certain communities, while they were very responsive and supportive to PVE projects, they did feel that in the long term, what those projects have impacted is that these communities and individuals are being labeled as extremists or as hotbeds of extremism. So it's important for any organization or any institution that is involved in CVE efforts to have in mind how inclusive these efforts are, how to avoid stigmatizing certain individuals, preventing those communities from being labeled as these hotbeds of extremism, because it's not only it's counterproductive, but it also is having negative impacts on the lives of these communities. So I think going forward, it's important to have these in mind. So how are we framing these projects, but also in terms of how inclusive they are we involving everyone? For example, a project that has been quite positive in our context has been, to involve a woman as part of Women's Security Forum. So understanding that women have been mostly left out of PVE efforts, we sought to involve them in a more proactive way to better understand how radicalization is taking place in these various communities, and how well we can engage the various categories within a certain communities in preventive efforts. So these are just briefly some of the points from Kosovo's context, and I'll be glad to answer any questions that you may have or and further engage in the discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tilta. I see that Nick, you are present here. I don't know at which point you of the conversation you joined, but please, every invited panelist has about 5 minutes. So anything related to your work with families, it would be valuable contribution. So please.
Thank you so much, Marco. I'm experiencing technical difficulties, I have to say, but obviously wanted to be involved in the meeting, and sounds very, very interesting conversation. There are a number of projects that we've been trying to develop in the UK around kind of families, and some interesting research as well. Obviously, your previous speakers have talked about engaging with women's groups and things like that, but there's been some really interesting research recently indicating the links between domestic violence, experiencing or being witness to domestic violence in the UK that is very strongly linked with this kind of process of radicalisation as well. So I wonder whether anyone can maybe give a perspective on their experiences as well. Maybe that's a significant area that's emerging as well.
Thank you, Nick. I would really encourage those of you who have worked with the issue on very different contexts than Western or Eastern European context. There would be a wonderful chance now to hear some of your reflections, and then hopefully we would have maybe another 5-8 minutes for open discussion. So please, would anyone volunteer to share their ideas? Humel, I see your hand is up.
Yes. Am I audible? Am I audible, sir?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. First and foremost, let me give a gratitude to Sir Marco, Sir Daniel, Miss Yuta, and Sir Elias, Sir Nick Danes, and I guess there was Dr. Magda. I hope she's still here, or maybe she's not around. But this is actually my first time to attend this kind of event with this focus group discussion or some sort of roundtable discussion in a virtual sense, and I'm very thankful with that. But I agree with one of the comments here by Miss or Mr. I do not know if he or she is a male or female. Farju Indin, who is also a Filipino, I guess. He or she is in Mindanao. I believe that all of you are quite aware that Philippines, being part of the Southeast Asia, has been one of the hotbeds of terrorism. Right. In fact, in 2017, there was this Marawi crisis. Those terrorists actually attacked the Philippines in 2017. And what we are actually talking about here is the context of community and families. And from my perspective, I believe that there were a lot of women, children, and at the same time, well, until now, the trauma has been lingering there. But what is good on the part of the government is that they were that the government was able to at least address some of the needs of the families there. However, there were a lot of areas in Marawi, particularly in the proximity areas of Marawi there in Mindanao, which is still not reconstructed. First and foremost, the oh, sorry. Are you Can you still hear me?
Yes, you are audible.
Yeah.
Please continue.
Okay. I believe that the attack during that time is that there was a protracted nature of conflict stemmed largely from some sort of distinctiveness of the built environment in Marawi. Same with what happened in the Afghanistan, Syria, Iran, and other areas in Middle East, where the terrorists have heavily attacked some of the areas. Marawi, compared with other provincial cities in Mindanao and the rest of the Philippines, Marawi's homes and commercial establishments are built of reinforced concrete. These are concretes, not built in cement. Okay, so I'm talking about the structure of a lot of houses of the families there, of the entire community, that are response to recurring instances of clan conflict and connected to jihadist movements. So when the skirmishes erupted in 2017, and the center of Marawi was some sort of a repurpose as fortified complex with reinforced homes and establishments turned into fighting positions. So those houses were actually seized the attention of both local and foreign analysts, for example, for several reasons. The first, the scale of violence in Marawi was actually high. The stake was actually high. So back in 2013, there was this attack in Zamboanga, which was considered the largest urban combat scenario. And second, the battle was actually saw the extensive use of commercial off-the-shelf systems, such as, for example, the drones for both parties of the conflict. And finally, that particular attack in Marawi proved to be a useful propaganda narrative of the IS or the Islamic State, which at the time was reeling from the loss of territory in Syria and Iraq. So a month thereafter, because it was May
Yeah,
2017
Jumal,
when
I'm sorry, but I need to ask you to just, condense your, if you have a specific comment or question so that we have time for others also. So please.
yes. Sorry for that. No, but with the context of our discussion today, I believe that what we have actually uh, lost in translation is the focus of the so-called aftercare. The aftercare shall include livelihood and reintegration assistance, employment, for example, and other opportunities and job referrals. Because here in the Philippines and perhaps in the other parts of the world, the local terrorist groups and the counter-terrorist groups are actually exploiting the poverty in a lot of states, not only in the Philippines. So I guess in the aftercare, we should focus again in the educational, vocational training programs, psychosocial services, through healing and reconciliation initiatives. And furthermore, we can also be a significant component of counter radicalization and de-radicalization programs as it serves as the confidence building measures or CBM, particularly for the former rebels. In the safe way houses here in the Philippines at the same time in jails, and at the same time for the violent extremists or the VEOs in prisons prior to their release. So last last but not the least, last year when we met a lot of counterparts in the United Nations high level talk, we have a national action or NAP PCVE or the National Action Plan NAP and NAP PCVE in the Philippines, and the United Nations actually was able to see the development from a hotbed state like the Philippines. Then we were able to have some improvements. However, out of 33, I believe we have reached so far like more or less 5. So I hope the panel could actually help not only with those states nearby in Europe, but also here in the Philippines, so at least give some assistance, not only in the methodologies and budget, but also on how we realize as a state the consciousness or the strategic communication that each and every one of us here, not only the government officials, the practitioners in security and defense sector, but also the students in college, high school, and elementary should develop some sense of, those are programs for the women, children, and the rest of the groups.
Thank you, Jugan.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think we need to move on. It's
Yeah,
exactly true that when we're talking about sort of the connection between radicalization and extremism, we're dealing with a hugely different kind of context. And what you're talking about, it's reminds me of the present day Iraq at the moment very much. We're very much connecting radicalization and extremism together, and when in extended conflicts, that it's not so self-evident that people who engage in radical actions are actually ideologically radicalized because of other reasons. So would anyone else like to please try to keep your comments short, maximum 1.5 minutes, so that we would still have a round of ideas before we have to end. Who would like to go next?
Sorry, can I still add some more? Like, a few seconds?
Let's give the room for others. Florence is up there. Please, Florence.
Thank you. I'm Florence Iminza from the Program for Christian-Muslim Relations in Africa, PROCMORA. And we are in Nairobi, Kenya. When it comes to radicalization and violent extremism and family roles, it's a very delicate area in this country. Why? Because of the centrality of the family in terms of young people and how they form them. Basically, a brief about the radicalization in Kenya. It was recognized among the families, especially when the young people left the country and were able to go away, study. But when they came, they had new ideologies that most of the families could not really understand their own children. So it became a bit difficult to some extent for them to know how would they handle the problem of radicalization. And today, it is still a very serious issue, particularly with the disconnect in schooling and the family. In Kenya, for instance, children have to go far away to study for a long time, a difference of almost 3 months. Sometimes students go to the university, so there's a disconnect between children and their parents. At the same time, the teachers may not really have a good follow-up in terms of the young people. So that gap that is found between families and children and young people when they are in learning institutions provide a huge challenge in terms of radicalization and violent extremism and the prevention of it. That we are trying to deal with. In our organization, we are trying to do programs at 2 levels. We are trying to institute a PVE in communities so that we bring in the families. And I like what my dear friend from Kosovo said, it has to be inclusive. And then we also try as much as possible to go into learning institutions so that we are almost bringing the 2 groups together and see how we can mitigate that. Otherwise, it still remains a huge challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Florence. Any other comments or questions, perhaps? Unless there's no direct questions, I would like to ask Daniel how you see the police forces are one of the key institutions with whom we have to have trustful relations. But for me, it sounds very worrisome, these developments in different parts of Western Europe, that actually extremism is reaching also or having impact on the security institutions. How important do you see this work, and what is our possibilities to work constructively in order to mitigate the negative impact of extremism entering into some of these key institutions? We just had a piece of news last week from Finland, which resembles very much of developments elsewhere.
Well, I think that's a very complex question, and I don't want to take up all of the rest time. I think Alias mentioned the securitization issue that has, been discussed in the CVE PV field for a long time. And besides the issue of potentially biased or extremist incriminated law enforcement intelligence agencies, I think, first of all, we need to understand that the sole idea, the purpose of PV or CVE is essentially a hybrid concept. And I've been observing this for a long time, that CVE, let's say just PV, CVE, the goal is to prevent or counter a violent extremist radicalization, whatever we understand under that label. So by definition, we are working to safeguard a society from someone who is already violent extremist or might become a violent extremist. We could also compare it to anyone who might be in a process of becoming a sexual offender, a pedophile, or mass murderer. So the topic we're talking about here is inherently securitized already. We don't need to securitize the PCV field because it is involving, at least to a certain degree, the security, the safeguarding aspect of our societies. So no one would argue, I think, that in a Western context, speaking about Western rule of law context, where police intelligence have the monopoly of force, it's their responsibility to mitigate direct threats, security threats to our society. On the other hand, before something criminal, illegal happens, it's the responsibility of communities and societies to do something in that regard. So I would argue that even social workers, teachers, psychologists, therapists, the people you mentioned, Alice, their core understanding, I guess, is also to keep the society safe, to have a positive impact on society. And then, of course, helping an individual not becoming radicalized or turning away from radicalization. So I think as you said, we're talking about essentially the same things. Now, we need to understand when it comes to violent extremism and terrorism, the threshold for tolerance for failure is extremely low in every society. So you could work for 10 years and 30 years and have a 99% success rate. And the one guy who slips through your net and does a terrorist attack, everyone will say, we need to shut down your program, it's not working. Because the risk is too high. If anyone goes on to commit a high impact terrorist attack who comes out of a de-radicalization program, the society will question CVE and PV in general. So I think that from the beginning on, we need to understand that essentially there is no artificial securitization. The security agencies naturally are involved because we're talking about violent extremism at different stages. And we need to understand that even a social worker, a teacher, psychologist, essentially they have to deal with potentially extremely dangerous individuals. And it's not their job to make a risk assessment, arrest someone, prosecute someone, put someone in jail. That's the job of other people. And they need to be in contact, in constant collaboration, because under your hands, you, Alias, you said you have decades of experience, systemic therapy training, all of these tools that are essential. I completely agree and support that. But if someone under your hands, in your counseling, continues to radicalize to a point where they actually a danger to the society of killing many people, I guess you would agree police needs to be involved. the intelligence needs to be involved, the courts need to be involved. It's their responsibility, right? So it's a dynamic, a fluid process of working with all the relevant institutions that our societies have at their disposal, both security and non-security wise. In Germany, there's no question. We have police agencies running their own de-radicalization programs and family counseling programs, and there are, of course, NGOs as well. Now, the question with radicalization, extremist infiltration of law enforcement is obviously a critical one. There's already in many communities massive lack of trust towards the police and towards the intelligence communities, and they're very understandable. And this only makes it worse, right? I think that if we don't have evidence that in a Western country, security agencies are completely and inherently infiltrated by extremists, right? These are, even though very concerning cases, and some more than others, we need to understand that these still are, it's a self-cleaning environment. The fact that we even know about these cases, that they're investigated, they're reported upon, that these people are fired, that these institutions reform and update themselves is a very encouraging sign. But still, there's no other alternative. In a Western country, there is no alternative to the police when it comes to law enforcement. There's also no other alternative to the courts and the rule of law and prosecution when it comes to taking the responsibilities for that. So we need to shield and protect these institutions. In my case, what we do where I work, we do a lot of training and self-awareness for police, for intelligence, for courts, for prosecutors, how to tell the signs, like family members. They need to know the signs as well. They need to understand what a radicalization process looks like, that they can prosecute a police officer or intelligence official or soldier or anyone else radicalized. I think, indeed, these institutions have been too naive, too self-assured, that they are not vulnerable to radicalization in many countries, and now they're waking up to that reality. And Germany has, we have much longer experience with dealing with extremism in the security agencies and military. But I think this will create a lot of public pressure to also reform, and this is something that Western countries can do. They can have this transparency, they can have independent reporting, intelligence, research, showing that these cases exist, and also pointing to what we can do against that.
Thank you, Daniel. Since we started about 4 minutes late, let's continue another 3 minutes. Jonas has a raised hand. Please, Jonas. So last question and comments, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Marco, and everybody else contributing here. I have a general question. By the way, I'm working in FCA, and I'm a member of the network of traditional and religious peacemakers. So my question is here very broad. I'm hearing that we are still in PVE. We are stick with the old-fashioned security approach. I'm hearing that many of the strategies that the member states in EU, for instance, are taking, they are based on mainly on security issues. And now, as we are in Europe, we are going to integrate, hopefully, many hundreds or thousands of fighters from Syria and Iraq. Of course, some of those will be sent to prison as well. But do you see that there is any consensus on the EU level on how to cope with this massive reintegration process? Are there any EU level soft measure programs similar to PVE strategies, or are these approaches and strategies scattered in different EU member states? Where we are at with this, where the EU is going with this integration challenge? Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas. I am not aware of the fact who would be most knowledgeable to answer this question, so the floor is open. And let's try to keep this. I mean, it's a broad question, but 2-3 minutes, and then unfortunately we have to close this session. Who would like to answer?
Marco, I think the answer to that question is that we're still trying to figure this one out. You know, the whole debate around returnees and foreign fighters and rehabilitation and risk assessment is something that I don't think anyone really has grappled with. And I think there are some pockets of good practice. I think in particular we have the Scandinavian countries which have been more kind of receptive towards returnees and kind of rehabilitation and de-radicalization. But then when we go into the UK, we know the long-running Shamima Begum saga and how we've stripped citizenship of individuals, which clearly shows the quite extreme draconian measures that some countries are prepared to take as well. I personally have worked with individuals who are returnees, and what you find is that there are pockets of very, very successful work in terms of, identifying what the real causal factors are, in particular when it comes to vulnerable young people. However, the challenge is, you're right, convincing individuals who are at the policy level how to develop these programs. I think one of the ongoing things a lot of them have said is that until you have standardized evaluation tools that identify what success looks like, and that is agreed upon by multiple, you could say, agencies and multiple practitioners, then we're never going to get a measure of what success is. And then, Daniel, this comes back to the point I'm saying. I have my idea of what success is when I engage in a therapeutic intervention. However, someone who really dictates what security should look like in my country has a different perspective. That's the challenge that we have. And I think there's an important piece of work where we actually come to models around maintaining security, because you're absolutely right. It's a fundamental responsibility all of us have to live in safe societies. But we need to come to have a model where we encompass that from different practitioner perspectives, yeah? And one of the things I just want to kind of finish on this point here is a lot of people said about standard evaluation tools and therapeutic kind of methodologies for intervention, yeah? I always believe this is more of an art than a science. Okay, and that's why it's been very difficult for us to really quantify what success looks like. I know that when I work with an individual, for example, who had been in a violent extremist space, and I see that I actually identify the core element of what their trauma is, they finally disclose for the first time in their life, this is what I went through. And then you can take them through a healing journey where they're able to then break the cycle of violence. Now, I have trust in my credibility as a practitioner in that process, but lots of other people don't. And that's at the heart. And so when I've worked with a number of individuals who are returnees, I can quite clearly see that it's more than what we call feigned compliance. I can see real transformation, a real transformative process. It's trying to convince others of that. That's the challenge.
Maybe I can respond very quickly in half a minute.
Okay, Magda, please, go ahead.
Half a minute. I'm not sure if I understand the question from Jonas, but is the question what is happening on the European level? Are you aware of what I mentioned in my contribution, the Radicalization Awareness Network? This is financed by the European Commission. It connects 6,000 practitioners from all EU member states. And on a regular basis, they come together, they exchange experiences, lessons learned, etc. They have a lot of publications. So I think, I'm not sure if you're asking for this, but this is what's happening. And I think it's an excellent network.
Yeah,
that was
also
exactly
agree with that.
My idea. I'm aware of this network too, but because I was hearing that so-called soft measures to integrate people, say, that come from Syria, they are underrepresented within the different approaches that the states are taking on security issues. That was actually my focus, that do we have any broad EU level strategy to integrate people and approach the problem to integration rather than from security perspective. But I really got interesting perspectives, and thank you, Alias, and also Magda for the comments. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we're over time, and I'm hugely thankful for your contributions and your presence, and I would like to thank Sarah and Tris for making this event possible, and keep up doing your good work and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.